guys, so I am here to do a second books that are worth the hype video. So I did one of these a couple of months back where essentially I looked at books that have perhaps got, thousands of ratings on Goodreads, are constantly talked about online, on BookTube, and that you might have heard a lot about but haven't necessarily picked up yet because you're not sure if they're worth all of that hype. So this is essentially just my 2 cents on those books. Obviously I'm already telling you before this video begins that I think they're worth the hype, so it's kind of like a narrowing down of some hyped up books from over the past few centuries that I think are definitely worth checking out. So if you haven't done so already, you might want to check out after this video. But without further ado, let's get into the book. So I'm going to start with a book where the hype feels very current, very now, very online, also like in the bookshops, but I feel like it's been talked a lot about on BookTube. I read it for the first time this year, so this probably isn't the first time you've heard me talk about it, but it's one that I definitely think is worth checking out, even if the hype makes you nervous. And that is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crawl by Jessica Townsend. So this is a children's book series and it's been hyped up. It's been compared to Harry Potter and sort of other popular children's books series of that vein, because it is the first in a series. It follows our central character who's discovering a new world full of magic and wonder, and there's like mysteries and eccentric characters and just like exciting plots to follow, as well as like sort of building friendships and relationships between the different characters. And yes, there are a lot of elements of this book that you do think, oh, this is very Harry Potter, but let's not pretend that Harry Potter wasn't also kind of derivative in certain aspects. It's not like everything about Harry Potter was completely original. Not that I don't absolutely adore Harry Potter, but some of these things are just kind of children's fantasy tropes, or yeah, there does seem to be a bit of a direct parallel with Harry Potter. So if that's really going to bug you, then fair enough, don't read it. But I think if you're okay with like experiencing some of those elements again, I think there's a lot that makes this story very unique and very fun and very appealing. The main character, Morrigan Crawl, is a cursed child and she's supposed to die on her 11th birthday, but instead she's whisked away by this character called Jupiter North, who takes her to Nevermore to compete in these trials to become a part of the Wonder Society, which Jupiter is a member of, and he's sort of her sponsor. So it's about Morrigan taking part in all of these trials, but also kind of learning some backstory as to why perhaps she's been chosen, why people have shown interest in her, and kind of what else is going on in like the larger society of Nevermore and the places outside of Nevermore, because they all kind of tie together. It's not a world exactly like our own. There are certain differences. Like I said, she's supposed to be a cursed child, so everyone's assuming she's going to die. So there's much more like awareness of magic in the everyday, but it's so much fun. I just found that this is one of those children's books that, having read it for the first time as an adult, I was still completely captivated by, and I don't think that happens to me that often with children's literature as an adult. Sometimes I'll read children's literature that I read before as a child, so it's a reread, and I'll like relive that joy that I felt upon first reading. But often if I read a children's book I've never read before as an adult, I'll be able to appreciate it and there'll be things I like about it, but it will still feel like a children's book, and I will still feel like I'm not the target demographic and that there is things lacking in it because I now read adult literature, whereas I didn't feel that with this book. I felt like it still ticked all the boxes, and I have the sequel out of the library right now and I can't wait to read it. This is a series I'm going to be like following over the next few years as it comes out, and I completely understand why it's become so popular. But just to mix things up a little bit, I'm going to go for a modern classic, or a early 20th century novella. Is it a novella? It's quite short. That is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is actually the only John Steinbeck book I've ever read, which seems slightly mad to me since I adored this book. So I'm surprised myself I haven't picked up any of his others, but I'm sure I will in years to come. This is a book I actually read in high school, which is one of the reasons I think it's so surprising that I loved it so much, because I think quite often people don't have positive memories of books they read in high school, and I get that in part because it's something like can slow you down when you're sort of reading it with a class rather than just reading it at your own pace. However, I adored the book at the time, and it's just a book that has stuck with me, and it's certainly a hyped up book. If you go on Goodreads, it is one of the most popular books that I've ever read on Goodreads. It follows George and Lenny in recession time America, kind of looking for work, wandering around, looking for sort of labouring work on farms, when they eventually end up at a ranch in California and get taken on as workers. It's very much about Lenny and George's dreams for their future. They are constantly talking about what they want to do when they're able to save up enough money, maybe like get a little farm or ranch of their own, and it's about their friendship. However, it's a very unforgiving world, and kind of tragic things happen, and it packs a punch for such a short book. It was such an emotional read. I cried when I was reading this book. George and Lenny are such interesting characters to follow, and it's just a really interesting look at kind of 1930s, I believe it is, America. But it is apparently John Steinbeck's most popular novel according to Goodreads, so I can completely get behind that and suggest it's a great place to start if you haven't read any John Steinbeck. Next up is a hyped book by a hyped author, and that is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Before I read this book, I'd heard so much about it. It was adapted into a film that was also pretty like highly praised. The author Kazuo Ishiguro recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and you know, is hyped up. That's a given for all these books. And I was hesitant going into it because of that hype, but ended up being completely swept away by it. It is a sort of dystopian novel, but it's very much focused on like a friendship group as opposed to exploring a different futuristic world. So we follow 3 friends who are raised together in this boarding school from birth until they are fully grown, and they don't have any parents, and they are educated alongside all these other children who don't have parents, and like this is their family and their environment that they are raised in, to behave a certain way and to take care of themselves for a future purpose that you don't know of initially, and you like gradually learn what the purpose of these young people's lives is to be as the novel unfolds. And like I said, you're following 3 different characters, 2 young women and a man, and it's about the relationships between all 3 characters, who can often treat one another quite cruelly, but also kind of like their emotions and feelings and desires, and just kind of their reactions to different circumstances that they're in, and like their humanity. And it's such a fascinating novel. It's such a fascinating character study. It's such a fascinating study of relationships and friendships, and also has that slow, curious, eerie build-up of what is going on in the background of their interactions, because they understand the world around them in a specific way, and it takes you a while as a reader to understand what they understand, because that is just their normal. And that's fascinating. But like I said, it feels very much about the relationships at the same time. And Kazuo Ishiguro is a gorgeous writer. I completely understand why he has won these awards and been given the Nobel Prize. Gorgeous, gorgeous writer, and personally this book for me is completely worth the hype. To return to a more recent book again though, I have Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. So the paperback of this one actually came out this year, and this came out in 2017, I believe, but I read it this year in 2018. Yes, it came out in 2017 originally, and I adored this book. This is now my favourite John Green book. It was my 3rd John Green book, and I did an entire video about this book. It completely resonated me in a way I was not expecting it to me. I found it so moving. It's a book I want to push on all my friends and tell them to read, because I think it will like sort of give them either some solace and some solidarity or some understanding of other people's struggles. And it's about a teenage girl in an American high school who has problems with OCD and anxiety and different like mental health struggles, and one of the ways that manifests itself is a skin picking problem with a particular wound in her finger that really hasn't had a chance to properly heal in years, because she constantly like reopens the wound, and she's obsessed with cleaning the wound, and kind of has a bit of like germophobia, I guess. And there is so many things I could relate to, so not necessarily the germophobia aspect, but the skin picking, obsessive skin picking manifestation of kind of like an OCD anxiety issue is something I can relate to. I have a problem with skin picking, and I talk about it way more in that video, and it just very much explored what was going on in her head, how it affected her relationships with other people, trying to communicate that with other people, but also how it affected maybe her ability to empathise with her friends, and kind of like how obsessed and in her own head she could get. And I think whether you have experienced similar mental health struggles, or you may just potentially know somebody who has, this is such an important book to read, because I think it will, like I said, either make you feel less alone, give voice to what's going on in your head, or it will just help you understand those around you better, which I think is really helpful, because sometimes it's so difficult to communicate those experiences and the things that are going on in your head if you have experiences like that having a book like this that really kind of gives it voice is so helpful. So I adored this, and I think it is one of John Green's best works. Would highly recommend. I'm gonna go for something that is like beyond hyped at this point though now, but I have to mention it because it is the most hyped, apart from Harry Potter. Like, it's just one of the most hyped books and series, and I genuinely think it is worth all of that hype, so I'm gonna mention it now, and that is, of course, the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. This is a young adult dystopian series. If you haven't heard of it before, they adapted it into a film series with Jennifer Lawrence, and it follows our protagonist Katniss Everdeen in a world in which the Hunger Games are these televised events every year where children from each district in this world are selected by lot and put into this massive kind of arena and have to fight to the death, essentially. And it's televised to all the other people, and its purpose is to like keep the outside districts outside of the capital kind of subjugated and in their place, and stop them from rebelling and acting up in a way that they had done years and years ago. So this was kind of a punishment, and it's fantastic because I think it explores so many contemporary issues. Like, it is such a parallel for so many things in our own society, like consumerism, PTSD, to name but two of the issues. But I think if you've read it, you know what I mean. There's a lot of parallels there, and it may be set in a futuristic setting, but all of the issues feel very current, and I just think it's so well written. The characters are fantastic, the friendships and relationships are brilliant. You just get completely wrapped up and absorbed in these stories and can't put the series down, or at least I couldn't. So I'm going to stop talking about it, but if you still haven't read The Hunger Games, please give it a chance. Probably even more hyped than The Hunger Games, but it has been around for a lot longer, so I'm going to mention it, or essentially all of the novels by Jane Austen. So I've actually only read 3 novels by Jane Austen: Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park and Persuasion, and of the 3 I've read, Persuasion is the one, according to Goodreads, it's the most popular, so I'll concentrate on Persuasion here. But I adored all of the Jane Austen novels I've read so far, and I have complete faith that I will enjoy her other 3 novels, which are Emma, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. But in terms of Persuasion, this is the one that I actually thought I would like the least, but ended up really, really enjoying. And this one is a little bit different from her others. It follows a woman technically past her prime. It's set in the 19th century, so she's actually just in her like mid to late 20s and hasn't yet got married, so shock horror, she's like, how's she going to find a husband when she's this old? But it's of its time, and she actually had the opportunity to marry a young man she was in love with when she was a lot younger, but was kind of convinced not to go through with that marriage because he wasn't technically good enough for her by her family. And it's years later, and she's come back in contact with him, although he now is much more successful, you know, would be a much more like appropriate match technically, but those bridges have been burned. He very evidently still holds a grudge against her for breaking it off with him, and it's about dealing with that kind of like decision that she made so many years ago, and how it's affected her life, and how she let other people persuade her against what she felt passionately about, and now what still remains perhaps between her and this young man, but no spoilers. And this was just such an emotional little love story, and like I said, quite different I feel from some of the other Jane Austen novels I've read, I think because of that time gap in the history between the male and female protagonists. But like I said, I did not think this would be one of my favourites. Thought it would be my least favourite, but honestly enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed her other novels. And that is generally my experience with Jane Austen novels so far. I find them so immersive. They are of a time and in some ways very outdated, obviously, but there are themes that still resonate, I think, with modern audiences. And I think the writing is just gorgeous. I think she's a gorgeous writer, and it takes you back to that time and place and to these characters, makes them feel very real, and has quite like a comforting reading experience. I think because of those lovely prose, it just wraps you up in like a warm blanket. So if you've not checked out Jane Austen yet, again, I would recommend it. But next I thought I'd go for a comic book series, and I'd say for BookTube at least, this is probably one of the most hyped up comic book series. It's been going for a few years now, and people have been reading and talking about it essentially since it started being published, and it's just one I've seen, like, you know, everyone on BookTube and their gran talk about essentially, and that is of course Saga. So Saga is a science fiction space opera comic book series following a man and a woman from different alien races whose people are at war with one another, but they have fallen in love amidst this turmoil. There's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet storyline going on there, and they've kind of had to run away to be together, and they've, at the beginning of the first issue of the comic book, give birth to their first child, which makes them a target for various different political factions, because people don't want the kind of public to know that their species can essentially get on, that they can fall in love, because that would kind of undermine this whole war that's been going on for years and ravaging their planets. And I think this comic book series is so worth the hype. I think I've read the first 6 volumes, and there's more than that now currently out, so I'm a little bit behind, but I feel like I've read enough and enjoyed enough to still say that I think it's worth giving a shot. I think this is a great comic book series if you haven't read many comic book series and are looking to get into them. I think the art is really good. I think the storyline is really fun. It's quite violent, it's very sexually explicit, like it is very much an adult comic book series. You know, that's who it's targeted at, and be aware of all that before going into it, that it's quite intense, but I think great. And then 2 more books before I go. The first one is a standalone fantasy novel, and that is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, again, just an incredibly hyped up author, and an author I've read a few books by. So Stardust is the only adult book I've read by him, because the rest of all those other books are children's books, and it is probably my favourite of the books by him I've read, probably because it's an adult book, so it just has that like extra punch. But Neil Gaiman is an author I still need to explore more of, but in the meantime I think Stardust is so worth the hype. This is another one that has been adapted into a film, and I actually saw the film of this before I read the book, and really enjoyed the film, but there is a lot of differences between the book and the film, which was nice actually, because I felt like I was gaining a new experience. Of course there's a lot of similarities and like overarching plot elements, unsurprisingly. It is an adaptation of the book, but at the same time, if you have seen the film, there's so much more to the book and actually quite a few differences, so I still think it's worth giving a read. It's so magical. It is set in this little village, and our protagonist lives on one side of the wall, and on the other side of the wall is a magical world, and this magical world is not always accessible, but there is a kind of market that comes to the edge of the wall every now and then, that people from his village will go over to and kind of visit. And years ago his father crossed over and fell in love with a woman in that world, and she then had a baby, which she then returned to kind of the ordinary world, our world on the other side of the wall, and this is now our protagonist, and he is crossing back over the wall into the magical world on a bit of a quest. He saw a shooting star fall to the ground and he is intrigued. So he has a girl that he's in love with in his world, and he sets off on this magical quest to help her fall in love with him, and it's all about that and discovering all the elements of this magical world, and there's lots of like kind of little layers of magic and mystery and intrigue, and it's so gorgeous and imaginative. Like, Neil Gaiman has a stunning imagination, you know, well done him. And he manages to convey that so effectively in his writing. I actually read an illustrated version of this book, which I could highly recommend to you, because I think the illustrations were stunning. So if you get a chance to check out the illustrated version, it's so worth it. But regardless, it's a wonderful story. And lastly, another fantasy book One I've actually mentioned a few times recently, so apologies for the repetition. I believe this was in my winter book recommendations. But that is A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. And honestly, I can't talk about this book enough until you've all read it, because I genuinely think it's spectacular. This is the first in the Gemma Doyle trilogy, and these are set in the 1890s and follow our protagonist Gemma Doyle, whose mother has just died, and she has grown up all her life in India but is now moving to London to attend a girls' finishing school in the last of her teenage years before she's sort of inducted into society. And she's going through all of this and she's experiencing really like a big change in her life. Obviously tragedy has struck, it's affected her family in various different ways, but she's also growing up, she's coming into her own, she is experiencing like her sexuality and her like womanhood for the first time, and it's about her like kind of discovering that side of herself, as well as building relationships with the new people in her life and coping with the loss of her mother. But there's also this magical side to the story where she can cross over into this magical world. She can create these portals and travel to this magical world, and basically her mother died under suspicious circumstances, so she's curious to see if there's a connection between this magical world and her mother's death and what's going on behind there. And it's actually quite a dark fantasy, bit of paranormal elements, I guess, and it like feels quite dark. Libba Bray does not hold back on the darkness in her books, and I really like that. I feel like it's really mysterious and creepy but magical, and I loved all of the characters in this series. So like I said, I just love these books. I have talked about them many times. I really hope I've convinced a few of you to pick them up and that you've also enjoyed them. But those are all the books I'm going to mention in this video. I hope I have perhaps opened your eyes to a book you weren't sure about despite the hype, and maybe you'll be interested in checking them out now. Like I said, I've done one of these videos in the past where I tell you about books I think are worth the hype, so I'll link that down below. I also did a video where I told you about books I don't think are worth the hype, so I will link that down below as well. Please do let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on any of these books, as well as what books you think are totally worth the hype and I should check out immediately. I'd love to hear from you, but until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!